Okay, and finally, to finish off this series of lectures on ACT, I want to talk about some of the empirical evaluations, so some of the research that's out there that talks about ACT. So Hayes and colleagues in 2006 carried out an analysis of the relationship between something that's called the Acceptance and Action Questionnaire and measures of psychopathology and the quality of life. So remember, we have to remember that from an ACT point of view, ACT considers psychological distress, mental health problems, low quality of life, etc., to be caused by psychological inflexibility. So there was a measure created called the Acceptance and Action Questionnaire to measure people's psychological flexibility versus their inflexibility. So because ACT effectively views these mental health problems and these mental struggles and quality of life in a different way to traditional mainstream psychology, they had to create an alternative measure to be able to measure psychological flexibility versus psychological inflexibility. So they created that measure, the AAQ, and they wanted to see, okay, how does it relate to some other existing measures of psychological mental health and quality of life? So the review looked at 32 studies. So when you combine all the participants in the 32 studies, you have a total of 6,628 participants. And they were interested, as I said, in investigating the relationship between the AAQ and psychopathology measures such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, trichotillomania, stress, pain, job performance, and negative mood or negative affect. So what this study found was that overall there were 74 correlations between the AAQ and other outcome measures. So there were 74 significant correlations between the acceptance and commitment therapy measure of psychological flexibility versus inflexibility, and this measure related with 74 other measures of psychological distress, psychopathology, etc. So overall, when you averaged out the effect size of this interaction, it was at about 0.42, which is moderate. So the AAQ measure of ACT processes had a moderate relationship with other psychological outcomes generally. So all the correlations that they found between the ACT measure of psychological flexibility or inflexibility and committed action versus the typical traditional measures of psychopathology, they all fit into the same model. So the relationships indicated that higher levels of psychological flexibility were associated with better quality of life and outcomes. So, for example, an individual who scores highly on a measure of depression is also going to score on the AAQ in a way that is consistent with psychological inflexibility. Individuals who score high on typical measures of quality of life are going to score highly on the AAQ in terms of their psychological flexibility. So, 3 additional studies showed that higher levels of psychological flexibility, so acceptance and value-based action, were associated with lower probability of having a psychiatric disorder as measured by the GHQ or the General Health Questionnaire. Furthermore, again in 2003, Bond and Bunce showed that higher levels of flexibility predicted better mental health, and this was at a medium effect size. And then ACT outcomes as measured by the AAQ are also associated with behavioral effectiveness in terms of job performance and chronic pain management. So again, it's important to remember that from an acceptance and commitment therapy point of view, there isn't a whole lot of diagnosis needed. Yes, typically because ACT is a therapy and clinical psychologists use it, therapists use it, counseling psychologists use it, typically they're going to be dealing with people who have a diagnosis. So ACT is going to be used on individuals with diagnoses. But again, ACT doesn't say you need to have a diagnosis in order for this to work. It just says that anybody can engage in cognitive diffusion. Anybody can engage in being present here in the moment. Anybody can engage in acting in a way that's in line with your values. So All of the ACT processes can be used, yes, with clinical populations, and they're very effective with clinical populations, but also can be used with non-clinical populations. So, for example, if you simply want to boost motivation, there's research that looks at ACT and procrastination. So, what are you doing when you're procrastinating? You're not being present, you're not being in the current moment. Perhaps you're fused with thoughts of avoidance. So, there's a lot of research that looks at ACT with non clinical populations. And because of that, there's quite an overlap, or there could potentially be an overlap between a lot of the ACT therapy or ACT training, as it's sometimes called. Sometimes ACT is referred to as acceptance and commitment training when it's not being used with a clinical population. So there is kind of a bit of an overlap, or there could be a bit of an overlap between acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training and coaching psychology. Because as you guys should know from your coaching module, coaching is often the use of clinical psychotherapies but adapted for a non-clinical population. And ACT doesn't really, care too much about a diagnosis or whether you're a clinical population or not. So there definitely could be overlap between acceptance and commitment therapy and coaching. And I have an article up on Moodle for you guys to have a look at that kind of takes ACT and turns it into a coaching intervention. So here you can see some of the studies and some of the relationships between the AAQ and some more traditional, if you want, measures of psychological distress or psychological um, problems. So if you look over there on the right-hand side, you can see that there's the DAS, which is the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. That's very frequently commonly used for measuring preclinical levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. And so there's a correlation there between the DAS and the AAQ. If we look over in the left one, we can see a whole host of other kind of typical measures that are used for a wide variety of different kinds of mental health and mental distress problems. So I'm going to talk about just two earlier pieces of research. There's been an exponential growth in the last 15 years of research into acceptance and commitment therapy. Between 2010 and 2014 alone, there was something like 500 papers published on ACT. And since then, there's been a whole lot more and a lot of developments in RFT and ACT. So I'm just going to talk about a couple, a few earlier pieces, and then one or two of the more recent pieces of work as well. So in 2003, Eifert and Hefner, they did a randomized control trial with 3 groups. So they had 60 highly anxious women, and they were randomly assigned to either a 10-minute acceptance condition, where they engaged in acceptance and mindfully observing feelings, being aware of them, seeing them, and they engaged in a metaphor task that's used in ACT called the Chinese finger trap metaphor. So that was the ACT-based condition group. Or they were put into an emotional control condition where they did an abdominal breathing exercise to try to stop the emotion or try to suppress the emotion or to try to get rid of the emotion. Or they were put into a no instruction condition, so a group that effectively got nothing. So compared to the control, the emotional control condition, or the no instruction participants, those in the acceptance condition were much less avoidant behaviorally, and they also reported a less intense fear, and they also reported less cognitive symptoms. So overall, the results were much more strongly in favor of those who had received the acceptance intervention. Research then carried out in 2004 was interested in looking at cognitive diffusion and negative self-referential thoughts. So negative thoughts about yourself. And could cognitive diffusion help with these kind of negative self-thoughts? So they use the milk exercise, which is repeatedly saying the thought out loud until it loses meaning. It just becomes syllables and there's not any function to the thought. So this diffusion technique was found to reduce both the discomfort of the thought and also the believability of the thought, more so than any of the comparison groups or any of the comparison controls that were used in the study. Okay, so this is a kind of bringing back to what I spoke about in terms of it doesn't need to be related to a clinical diagnosis. So this piece of research by Zhang in 2018, I'm going to have up on Moodle as well. So this is the use of acceptance and commitment therapy for changing health-related behaviors. So improving health behaviors such as improving exercise, healthy eating, um, sticking to medication regimes, etc., etc. So this paper looks at using the ACT model and the ACT6 core processes to try to improve maintenance of long-term health behavior change. And it was found to be useful, it's found to be beneficial, and it's found to be something that practitioners and researchers can use to help improve overall general health behaviors. So this piece of research then is a little bit more in detail, a little bit more technical. So this piece of research is interested in looking at, from a theoretical standpoint, stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory and their application in behavioral therapy. So it kind of talks about the differences between traditional behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and then third wave behavioral therapies, and how stimulus equivalence and RFT work within third wave behaviorism and within third wave behavioral therapies. So it is a bit of a technical article, but I will put it up in case anyone's interested in looking at the technical theory that underpins and relates to acceptance and commitment therapy. So as I said, over the last 15 to 20 years, there have been over 100 randomized controlled trials published using ACT, and they have shown the efficacy of ACT for dealing with a number of mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, chronic pain, psychosis, PTSD, eating disorders, etc., etc. So ACT has massively increased in popularity, and there have been over 100 RCTs carried out, but hundreds and hundreds more articles have been published on ACT that aren't necessarily RCTs. And ACT has also become very popular as a therapy, clinical psychologists using it, counseling psychologists using it, also coaching psychologists using it. And within an Irish context, Dr. Louise McHugh in UCD, she does a lot of research and a lot of training in ACT, looking at ACT efficacy for a wide variety of conditions and looking at how RFT and ACT work together. In St. John of God's, they've piloted a lot of research in terms of ACT for group therapy, so using ACT interventions and using ACT as a therapy in a group setting. And then in St. Vincent's Hospital, there's also been research carried out on using ACT for individuals with chronic pain conditions and chronic gastro-related conditions. So using ACT for physical health-related problems to help the people who are suffering from these chronic health problems. But obviously, like all areas of research, it's not all gold, it's not all perfect. There have also been plenty of critics of ACT. There's been plenty of meta-analyses carried out that indicate that ACT isn't effective. There's always going to be two sides to a story. There's always going to be research that says, yes, this is great, and research that says, no, this isn't great. One specific individual, Lars Goran Ost, he's continually published research that says that no, maybe ACT isn't as effective as people claim it is, and that there needs to be more research carried out on ACT. So there's always going to be two sides of the story, and I think it's important to say that ACT, there are critics of it as well, and there's research that says that it doesn't work, but there's also plenty of research that says that it does work. And I think it's also important to note that ACT isn't going to suit absolutely everybody. And I, as a practitioner, as a researcher, as a psychologist, don't believe that there is one model that suits everyone. And I don't believe anyone should be completely focused or completely absorbed by one model, one discipline of psychology. Yes, obviously, during the course of this module, I've been massively behavioral. In my training, am behavioral, but I also did work with psychiatrists. I have training in a wide variety of other kind of psychological therapies and psychological disciplines. But I think it's good to know, what do you believe? What do you think works? What's your underpinning for psychology? And ACT isn't going to work for everyone. I won't use ACT with everyone. You might take some bits and pieces from it, but it is just good to have an awareness of different models and different ideas that are out there in terms of psychological theory and in terms of therapy. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up by showing you this article here. This is a kind of empirical review of the conceptualization of ACT in terms of how it views anxiety and how it views depression. And it also then gives a kind of systematic review of 36 randomized control trials. So the key points of this article: ACT is a modern form of CBT based on functional contextualism and based on RFT. This article reviews the core features of ACT's theoretical model of psychopathology, so how ACT views mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and treatment as well as the therapeutic approach. It then provides a systematic review of RCTs evaluating ACT for depression and anxiety disorders. And then across 36 RCTs, ACT appeared to be more effective than waitlist conditions, treatment as usual, with largely equivalent effects relative to traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. So, effectively, what they're saying here is if you're comparing ACT to either people just being on a wait list waiting for therapy or getting just engaging in what they usually do to try to help with their anxiety or depression, ACT is more effective. Then, when you compare ACT to traditional CBT, so the Beck CBT that we were talking about earlier, ACT is equally as effective an outcome for depression and anxiety as traditional CBT. Evidence from several trials also indicates that ACT treatment outcomes are mediated through increases in psychological flexibility. So, again, the basis for the improvements in individuals with anxiety and depression is an increase in their psychological flexibility. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for all of our ACT stuff. As I've said, there are lots and lots of articles and lots of resources online. So if you need any more help, have a look at the resources and articles that are online. As I said, you don't have to go through them all. I'm not expecting you to go through them all, but have a look at some of them, see what you think is appealing or is of interest to you, and read a little bit further on it.